And the clever things about markets is you can always take money that's coming later and bring it forward through capital markets. And we can think of structures that actually could advance some of the private money. But what we have to, in terms of making markets work well, I think we have to think of the earlier part of the story as being primarily government money. Now, I've worked in a Ministry of Finance. It was actually quite a good Ministry of Finance. I was chief economist of the World Bank and spent a lot of my time with ministers of finance. And they, not all of them, of course, but most of them were also serious and conscientious. All of them are very cautious about public money. Now, particularly they're cautious about public money because of the events in the financial economic world over the last few years, which many of you will have noticed, they are under greater pressure, at least in rich country public finances, than they have been for a very long time. That's why we have to take the argument to finance ministries very strongly, because this will be, in large part, in the beginning of the story of the fight against deforestation, something that requires public money. That case has to be made, and it has to be made strongly. Now, as somebody who worked at a senior level in the Ministry of Finance and worked for the World Bank and advised people on these issues, you tend to be quite conservative. Why would you want to borrow rather than raise taxes? Well, those things are always evenly balanced. But actually, in this case, on this subject, we have a clear argument for some role for borrowing in public finance. Why? Because if you ask yourself, if our children were roughly like ourselves, let's imagine they have preferences roughly like us, would they like to have a better climate and a bit more debt, or a bit less debt and a lot worse climate? Now, I think the answer to that question is obvious. You can pay off debt over time in a way that suits you. Much of the damage, the rundown, the destruction of the environmental capital would be irreversible. So, as a rather conservative person in approaching public finances, you have to recognize that sometimes the arguments for borrowing are better than others. And this is one where, in the logic of the economics, in the logic of the market failure, of the externality, there's some case for some of this funding to be debt funding. Now, I think in Copenhagen, we're going to have to look very hard at various sources of funding. This is one of the key areas. I would argue we want at least $15 billion a year by 2015 for support for the battle against deforestation. And much of it in that early period will have to be public money. We're going to have to look very hard, all of us here, from rich countries and poor countries. I'm not from either rich country or poor country. I'm from a poor university, the London School of Economics. It's a very good one, but we're going to have to ask ourselves a question: how do we raise the kind of money that we're going to need? If you look at adaptation in Africa and other vulnerable countries, if you look at the importance of developing and employing new technologies, we need at least $50 billion a year by 2015 to fund the kind of activity we're talking about, of which deforestation is a major element. We've got to look right across the board at new sources of finance. We don't want this to be just rejuggled money, non-additional money. We've got to look right across the board at auctioning of permits, debt instruments that I just mentioned, taxation of things which are not yet taxed under carbon taxes or auction schemes, such as international aviation and maritime. We should be looking at creative uses of special drawing rights. We should be looking at things like transaction taxes, Tobin taxes. We should be looking right across the board, because one of the outcomes of the work here has got to be a serious financing package, and given the pressures on public finances, it's got to be in large measure put together with new sources of funds, both because of the pressure on rich country public finances, but also because the developing world should have some kind of confidence that it will be additional. So let's build up the story of prices. Let's build up these markets. Let's make the trees more valuable, standing than cut down. But let's also recognise the investment, and a lot of it from public money, that has to take place, and we have to get serious about where that public money comes from. Thank you very much.